They looked at you like you were replaceable. They treated your loyalty as an option. And worst of all, they walked away as if your presence never mattered, like your sacrifice, your kindness, your quiet endurance were invisible to their eyes and weightless to their hearts. But make no mistake, what they took for granted, heaven took into account. What they dismissed in silence, God noted in full volume. And now, in the emptiness they've created, your absence will echo louder than your presence ever did. There's a pain more haunting than betrayal. It's the realization that someone you discarded was the one silently holding everything together. That the very soul you ignored, belittled, and brushed aside was the source of comfort you now lack, the peace you now crave, the love you'll never find again. They thought detachment was power, that indifference made them strong. They wore their coldness like armor and called it maturity. But real strength is not in who can leave first. It's in who stayed the longest, prayed the hardest, and loved the most sincerely. You see, God has a way of flipping the script when it's time. The person they hurt, the one they left as though you were a shadow, God now begins to exalt. While they roam through meaningless connections, empty smiles, and false pride, He teaches them what true value is by removing yours. And when God removes you, He doesn't just subtract, He creates a void that no one else can fill. Your silence becomes deafening, your kindness becomes haunting, and your absence? It becomes the loudest sermon they'll ever hear. They believed your patience was weakness, that your forgiveness meant approval. They mistook your humility for low worth. But the day is coming, and for some it has already arrived, when they will sit in silence and feel the sharp ache of what they once had, but never honored. And here's the divine mystery. God doesn't need revenge to bring justice. He simply allows the one who was pure to walk away, and in that vacancy, He lets the consequences unfold. They won't be destroyed by your anger, they'll be undone by your absence. There will be a dinner they can't enjoy because your laughter is missing. A moment of triumph they can't celebrate because your support is no longer there. A crisis they won't survive well because your prayers are no longer covering them. And when they finally look around in desperation, realizing they're surrounded but still alone, it will dawn on them. The one they ignored was the anchor to their peace. Your worth will not need explanation. It will be felt. Your light will not need to argue. Its loss will be blinding. Because people never forget how you made them feel. They only remember it once you're no longer making them feel it. Let this be your reminder. Your role in their life was never small. It's just that they were too small to understand your role. But God understood it. And now, He is writing your restoration with ink made of silence, distance, and transformation. You're not disappearing, you're being set apart. Not for revenge, but for renewal. Not for war, but for witness. Because when God begins to restore what was stolen from you, He will do it in full view of those who acted like you meant nothing. And the pain of your absence will preach the truth louder than your presence ever could. It's one of the cruelest kinds of betrayal. Not the one that comes with loud accusations or obvious wounds, but the quiet kind, the subtle kind. The kind where someone close to you begins to treat your presence like background noise, where they see your sacrifices as expectations and your kindness as their right. And yet you say nothing. You absorb their sharpness without flinching. You smile through moments that should have broken you, and you continue to give without ever receiving. They thought you didn't notice, But what they failed to understand was that you noticed everything. You simply chose not to respond with the same darkness. You chose dignity over revenge. You chose silence over drama. And they misread that silence as weakness. But heaven doesn't misread anything. What man overlooks, God records with exactness. The sighs you let out at night, the tears you wiped away before anyone could see, the prayers whispered from a place of exhaustion. God witnessed it all. You may have felt invisible in their world, but you were never invisible in God's. He saw the effort you put into holding things together when they were falling apart. He saw how you kept showing up with love, even when they responded with cold indifference. He saw how your soul bent to accommodate their storms, just so they wouldn't have to face the thunder of their own chaos. God noticed every moment you were left carrying the emotional weight of people who never once asked how you were doing. They assumed their behavior was hidden behind the veil of daily routine. They acted cruelly behind closed doors, only to show kindness when others were watching. They built a public image on your back while quietly diminishing your worth behind the scenes. They performed affection when it was useful and withdrew it when your presence no longer entertained them. To the world they appeared loving, but you knew the truth. And so did God. He doesn't need confession to administer justice. He needs honesty in the heart. And when he sees a heart that is pure, that loves despite being unloved, that stays when every reason says to go, he takes note. There's something sacred about a person who continues to do good even when goodness is not returned. There's a holiness in remaining kind in the face of indifference. And that holiness is what God honors. You may have felt like no one was standing with you, but you were never standing alone. The Creator of heaven and earth was with you in every moment of that silent suffering. He stood beside you when they raised their voices and cut you with their tone. He sat beside you in the room when you smiled while swallowing pain. He walked with you to places they wouldn't go emotionally, carrying the part of your burden they never cared to see. Sometimes we ask why God doesn't stop people from hurting us when he sees it all. But often, God allows things to unfold because he's building evidence, not for the world, but for your soul. He's allowing the truth to gather until it can no longer be denied. Because when he moves without apology. He doesn't need to expose them in front of the crowd. He only needs to pull you out from among them. And when he does, they'll be left with the echo of everything they once ignored. What they thought was hidden will surface, not because you will speak, but because God will make the truth undeniable. Your silence will become their mirror. Your restraint will become their judgment. And the same eyes that rolled at your kindness will one day search the crowds for a glimpse of the person they used to know, the person they mistreated, misunderstood, and misjudged. You didn't have to prove anything to anyone, because the one who matters saw it all. He saw your loyalty. He saw your heartbreak. He saw how you fought to protect them even as they plotted your replacement. And now, he is moving, not with noise, but with divine intention. He's bringing balance where injustice reigned, not through your hands, but through his. There is a quiet strength in stepping away from the people who once made you feel like you were too much, yet never enough. When someone acts like your presence is optional, eventually God teaches you how powerful your absence can be. It's never an easy decision to walk away, not when your heart is sincere, not when your intentions were pure, and not when you stayed far longer than you should have. But God, in his perfect timing, begins to show you that staying in places where your soul is being eroded is not loyalty, it's slow self-destruction. And when he calls you to walk away, He does not do it to punish them through your absence. He does it to protect you and reveal something they could never see while you were still within reach. They didn't see your value because they were used to your presence. Your kindness became background music. Your empathy became an expectation. You were the peace in the storm they created, and because you kept calming the chaos, they believed there was never a storm. But when God calls you into silence, when He calls you into separation, He does something profound. He lets your absence become a mirror they cannot escape. Every little thing they overlooked suddenly becomes obvious. The meals you made, the prayers you whispered, the late-night conversations, the quiet way you encouraged their dreams. All of it begins to resurface, not as memories, but as losses. At first, they pretend they don't notice. Pride whispers that they are better off. Arrogance tells them you were replaceable. But absence doesn't lie. Absence starts to whisper in ways presence never did. It doesn't shout, it lingers. It shows up in their quiet moments, in the morning silence, in the lonely victories, in the echo of a laugh that no longer rings in the room. God allows the space you leave behind to grow louder with every passing day. He uses that void as a sacred revelation, a truth that could never be spoken while their egos were still leading the way. People rarely realize the true weight of someone's presence until it's gone. When you were near, your value was obscured by familiarity. They saw you, but they didn't see you. Now that you're no longer accessible, they begin to reach for someone who doesn't answer. They begin to crave what they once criticized, and that craving grows. Not because you're perfect, but because you were true. You were real. You were the one who loved them beyond reason, who held them together when they were falling apart inside. And now, in the emptiness left behind, God begins to awaken what their pride had numbed. He doesn't force repentance. He doesn't demand apologies. He simply lets your absence reveal what your presence tried so hard to give, your heart. He allows them to walk through seasons where replacements fall short, where conversations feel forced, where support is conditional. Slowly they begin to see that not everyone gives like you. Not everyone stays like you. Not everyone prays like you. And in that revelation, God teaches them what they refused to learn when love was free. Your absence becomes the very thing that teaches them the weight of what they lost. And as time passes, the noise they once used to distract themselves grows quiet. The distractions fail. The new people don't understand their soul the way you did, and they are left sitting in the very silence they used to mock. Only now, that silence preaches truth. That silence becomes sacred, because in that emptiness, they come face to face with the consequence of taking a heart like yours for granted. And the most powerful part? You didn't have to shout. You didn't have to explain. You didn't need to justify your exit or defend your worth. God made your absence the sermon they can't forget. And every time they try to forget, something small reminds them of you, a phrase, a smell, a song, a moment. You are no longer present, but your value is louder than ever, because when God turns absence into a weapon of revelation, He doesn't just remove you, He awakens them. When you are constantly surrounded by those who cannot see your worth, your reflection begins to fade. You begin to shrink to fit the comfort of their blindness. You lower your volume so they can remain at peace in their chaos. You carry your pain quietly because they treat your vulnerability as an inconvenience. Over time, the weight of being misunderstood doesn't just exhaust you, it begins to change you. That's when God steps in. Not always with thunder or a divine sign, but with a whisper that says, it's time to come out from among them. Because what they called too much heaven calls sacred. What they dismissed as weakness, God sees as strength. And the moment He removes you, it is not rejection, it is revelation. People often confuse God's separation with punishment, but it is one of the deepest expressions of His care. He separates the wounded not to shame them, but to heal them. He pulls the misunderstood away from those who diminish them, because He knows elevation cannot happen in environments that belittle your spirit. When they could not recognize the value of your heart, God did. When they reduced your efforts to background noise, He was listening with perfect attention. And when they rolled their eyes at your sensitivity, heaven rejoiced in it. Elevation doesn't happen in the crowd, it happens in the wilderness. In the silence of separation, you begin to hear your true voice again. You begin to dream again. You remember who you were before the mockery, before the gaslighting, before the guilt tripping. And slowly the fog lifts, the clarity returns. You realize that the very people who made you question your purpose were never qualified to judge it in the first place. They were not your mirrors, they were your distractions. God allows the distance to increase, not to hurt you, but to save you. Because in that space you find your footing again. You rise from the place where you were once trampled. You see yourself not through their eyes, but through His. And what you find is stunning. You are not too much. You are not difficult. You are not broken. You are a masterpiece, misread by people who only knew how to love conditionally. And something miraculous begins to happen. Once you are no longer begging for crumbs at tables you were never meant to sit at. God begins to prepare a new table, one where your name is known and your worth is never questioned, one where you are celebrated, not tolerated. He begins to open doors you never dared to knock on before, because you were too busy trying to fix the broken doors behind you. He begins to restore everything they overlooked, not just your confidence, but your calling. And while they remain stuck in cycles of false fulfillment, pretending your exit meant nothing, heaven is lifting you to heights where their opinions can no longer reach. They may still speak about you, but they can no longer touch you. Because what God separates, He sanctifies, and what He sanctifies, He strengthens. He's not just elevating your position, He's restoring your identity. The one they tried to erase with their silence, their mockery, their betrayal. You didn't walk away to prove anything. You walked away because God whispered that it was time. And that whisper was not weakness, it was wisdom. And in that wisdom, He will build you into someone unrecognizable to those who thought they had you figured out. Because when God separates, it's not to isolate. It's to prepare you for a glory they were never meant to witness. Sometimes God does not raise His voice to correct people. He simply removes you. He doesn't always argue with those who mistreated you or try to change their minds about you. Instead, He steps back and lets time and emptiness do what explanations could not. And in that quiet void, when your warmth is no longer filling their spaces, when your presence is no longer balancing their chaos, He teaches them a truth that your words could never reach. There is something about emptiness that exposes reality in a way that noise cannot. God allows the absence of your voice, your care, your presence to become the loudest teacher of all. While you were there, they thought you were just being nice. They called your love emotional, your forgiveness naive, your gentleness too soft. But now that you're gone, the depth of what you carried becomes painfully obvious. It's not just the words they miss, it's the atmosphere you brought with you. You were the first to say sorry, the first to ask if they were okay. The one who stood between them and their own destruction by offering love when it wasn't deserved. And now, in the hollow space where your grace once stood, they begin to feel the echo of your absence. God allows them to sit in that emptiness, not to punish them but to teach them. Because some people can only learn through loss. When words fall on deaf ears, silence becomes the only language left. And that silence is not empty. It's filled with memories, with what-ifs, with moments they used to overlook but now replay in their minds over and over again. They begin to notice the chair you used to sit in. They remember how your laughter used to change the tone of a whole room. They realize that no one else remembers the small things the way you did. And with every reminder, the lesson deepens. You didn't leave with bitterness. You left with quiet resolution. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped knocking. And now the silence you left behind is preaching sermons they can't ignore. There are no more apologies to reject, no more efforts to sabotage, no more moments to twist into criticism. All that's left is the quiet truth. They lost something holy, and the weight of that truth sits with them in places you used to fill with light. In the absence of your presence, God begins to uncover their illusions. The distractions they used to numb their conscience no longer work. The people they replaced you with don't feel the same. The comfort they once had in your consistency is now replaced with the unease of inconsistency. And it dawns on them slowly. No one else brings the peace you brought. No one else offers the safety your soul provided. Because God doesn't allow your absence to go unnoticed when your presence was a divine gift. It is not vengeance, it's revelation. The revelation that what they took for granted wasn't ordinary, it was extraordinary. That the person they ignored was the person God had placed in their life to be a blessing. And that blessing walked away without curses, without drama, without shouting. Just silence. A silence that grows louder with time, a silence that wraps around their pride and softens it into awareness. You were never loud in your departure, but God made sure your absence spoke. And so, the emptiness becomes a tool in the hands of the divine, not to destroy them, but to awaken them. Because where your voice was once disregarded, your silence now speaks louder than 1,000 conversations ever could. You were never broken because you were weak. You were broken because you chose to love with your whole heart in a place that only knew how to take. You poured from your cup until it ran dry, thinking they would one day see the value in your sacrifice, but they didn't. They only noticed the absence of overflow, not the well from which it came, and when the drought hit your soul, they blamed you for no longer being able to water theirs. Yet, through every silent hurt, every invisible wound, every internal scream you buried with a smile, God was not only watching, He was working. It may have felt like you were walking alone, but you were being held in a holy process. In the quiet spaces where no one saw the agony behind your eyes, God was there, gathering every tear, listening to every word you never said aloud. He didn't rush to fix what was breaking, not because He was absent, but because He was using the breaking to build something unshakable in you. Sometimes, the most sacred construction happens behind the curtain of silence, not in the spotlight of affirmation, but in the shadows of abandonment. That is where God takes broken pieces and reassembles them, not just to look whole, but to be whole. There is a kind of strength that cannot be taught in easy seasons. It's the kind of strength forged in fire, shaped by rejection, and sealed in resilience. You didn't become stronger by pretending you were okay. You became stronger by surviving nights when no one checked in on you. You grew in the moments where you cried to God and not to people. You learned to lean into His voice because all other voices had gone silent. And in that deep loneliness, something happened. Your roots went deeper. They saw you as weak because they saw the tears. But God saw the depth behind those tears, the purity, the endurance, the hunger to love even after being wounded. They saw fragility. God saw fortitude. Because what you went through would have destroyed someone else, but you kept showing up. You kept believing. And now, while they live in the shallow waters of comfort, you are being built into someone who knows how to survive storms and still speak peace. God never wastes brokenness. Every shattered expectation, every unreturned affection, every insult you bit your tongue through, it all became material in His hands. You weren't being dismantled, you were being rebuilt, quietly, thoroughly. And in that rebuilding, He gave you something more valuable than validation. He gave you identity. Not one defined by their approval, but one rooted in divine purpose. You are not the sum of what they overlooked. You are the product of what God refined. And now, as you begin to rise, not with noise, but with quiet confidence, they'll look and wonder how you survived. They'll be shocked by your glow, confused by your peace, curious about your strength. But they won't understand it, because they didn't witness the nights when you fell apart in private. They didn't see the prayers, the journals, the hours spent wrestling with pain and choosing forgiveness anyway. Only you and God know the full cost of your healing. And that is why it's sacred. While they go on with their lives unchanged by the wreckage they caused, you are walking in restoration. Not because life suddenly became fair, but because God made you unshakable in silence. The parts of you that were once fragile have now become firm, and though they may never apologize, though they may never understand what they did to you, it no longer matters, because God saw, God healed, and most of all, God built you again, stronger, deeper, and more radiant than before. There are moments in life when silence begins to speak louder than words ever could. When someone loses a presence they once overlooked, they are left with something far more tormenting than confrontation: regret. Regret does not shout. It doesn't slam doors or throw accusations. It whispers in the quiet hours of the night. It follows people into moments of joy and stains them with sadness. It slips into laughter and turns it hollow. That is the kind of speaking God allows when He knows that direct correction would be wasted. He lets the weight of regret preach the sermon they ignored when love was freely offered. When they dismissed you, they thought they were choosing freedom. They believed walking away from your softness was a sign of strength. They mistook your vulnerability for excess, your love for weakness. And because they never imagined losing you would mean anything, they never paused to think about what life without you would actually feel like. But God knew. He knew what you carried. He knew what they were letting go, and so He allowed them to make their choice, not because He was punishing them, but because some people must be taught, not through warning, but through experience. Regret is the kind of pain that doesn't leave marks on the skin. It bruises the soul. It shows up unexpectedly and sits down beside them in the spaces you used to fill. They hear your name in passing and feel something tighten in their chest. They scroll through old photos and suddenly can't breathe the way they used to. There's an empty seat at the table and they laugh less freely, because in the back of their mind, your absence takes up space. That's what regret does. It does not always bring people to tears. It brings them to truth. It reminds them of everything they had and didn't honor. And God allows that truth to settle slowly, not all at once. At first, they carry on as if nothing happened. They surround themselves with noise, with people, with distractions. But over time, the voices get quieter, the excitement fades, the replacements start to feel empty. And then comes the realization, nothing feels like you. No conversation feels as natural. No companionship feels as safe. No presence carries the peace that yours once did. And in that moment of clarity, regret takes center stage, not as punishment, but as revelation. God doesn't always seek to destroy the proud. Sometimes He allows pride to decay from within. When someone refuses to hear the truth through kindness, they end up hearing it through absence. And that absence becomes a space where regret flourishes. It doesn't just remind them of who you were, it reminds them of who they were in your presence. They remember the version of themselves that could have grown if they had chosen humility over ego. And now that you are no longer there, that version of them is lost too. That's the cost they never calculated. There is a strange justice in how God lets the soul speak when words no longer can. Regret becomes the echo of every moment they missed. It replays scenes not to torture them, but to show them that what they had was never ordinary, that love like yours is not disposable, that kindness like yours is not replaceable. And the more they try to recreate what they once had, the more the emptiness of their attempts reveals the uniqueness of your presence. They may never confess it, they may never speak your name again, but their silence is not peace. It's the roar of regret. It's the unspoken truth that what they lost was sacred. God let them choose, and they chose distance. But now, that distance has become the longest road back, a road they may never walk, but one they'll always stare at. Because regret has a way of turning the heart toward what the mind denied. And God lets that process unfold, not with fury, but with perfect wisdom. There is a divine irony in how God reveals someone's value. He doesn't always do it by lifting them up in the eyes of those who once dismissed them. Sometimes He simply removes them and lets absence do the revealing. The same people who used to speak over you, correct you, minimize you, and treat your love like it was cheap. God now lets them face a life without you, not in anger, but in clarity. He lets your absence become the message that was never received when you were present. And in that message, your worth begins to rise. Not by noise, but by contrast. You gave your best without asking for credit. You stayed loyal even when loyalty was not returned. You loved people through their lowest moments and expected nothing but honesty in return. But instead, you were treated like a placeholder, an afterthought, a convenience. And so, God stepped in. He removed you, not as punishment, but as preservation. You weren't meant to spend your life begging to be seen by people whose eyes were clouded by ego. And now that you're gone, your value speaks louder than anything you could have ever said. God has a way of revealing truth through absence. People begin to notice the things they never acknowledged when you were present. They remember how you prayed before big decisions, how you calmed storms in the middle of chaos, how your presence was an anchor when everything else felt unstable. And the more they try to fill your place, the more they realize it cannot be done. Because you weren't just a person, they begin to understand you were a covering. You were sent into their life as a grace they never recognized. And now that grace has been lifted. In their desperation, they may try to rewrite history. They'll tell others you changed, that you walked away, that you were never truly invested. But deep down they know the truth. They know the patience it took for you to stay as long as you did. They know the restraint it took not to speak on the pain you carried. And they know the love you gave was purer than anything they have now. God allows their own conscience to testify against them. He doesn't need to expose them to others. He exposes them to themselves. Meanwhile, you begin to rise, not in arrogance, but in purpose. You are no longer defined by their inability to see you. You are defined by the one who created you with intention. God begins to surround you with people who don't need convincing to honor your presence, people who see your worth without needing to be taught. And in this new atmosphere, your spirit breathes again. You laugh deeper. You sleep easier. You begin to thrive, not because life suddenly became easier, but because the weight of being misunderstood has finally lifted. And all the while, those who misjudged you sit with the knowledge that they lost someone heaven sent. Your absence becomes a mirror to their soul, and it reflects everything they failed to appreciate, every quiet sacrifice, every moment you chose grace over reaction, every part of you that they tried to dismiss now stands tall, not in front of them, but in their memory. God didn't need to elevate you in their eyes. He simply removed you from their view. And now, your absence speaks a language their heart can't unhear. You don't need revenge. You don't need their applause. Your absence has become your answer. And God is using it, not just to reveal who you were, but to declare who you've always been.